I'm Alison Scott-Bowman. I'm a professor in law, and this evening is part of a sequence of work that we're doing, partly in Westminster and partly here, so that we have voice and agency. Because if you think about it, the universities are much mocked and not seen as prestigious and full of evidence. So we work in Westminster and we bring experts together here as well. If you want to join us, then Resham, who's here, Resham, give us a wave. Resham would be available to talk afterwards. We have run events in this series that we're running on migration, on detention, and we think, I don't know what you think, it maybe come out during the evening, that the new government seems to be reusing the old narratives. So they're saying, you know, we're going to stop the boats, we're going to secure the borders, we're going to deport. None of those consider what the alternatives might be. That's my first job to tell you about ICOP, Influencing the Corridors of Power. If you're interested, please let us know. My second job this evening is to introduce our brilliant chair. Dr. Anna Linley is a reader here at SOAS in Migration, Mobility and Development. Her research looks at the hard edges of immigration regimes, particularly in the UK, where she has worked on immigration, detention, asylum processes, and most recently exploring refugee homelessness and housing. All those three areas are steeped in inhumanity, which really we can't allow to continue. We have to speak truth to power. We have to say there are different ways of telling this story and different ways of improving the situation. So her work has been published in Geoforum, Migration Studies, and the Journal of Human Rights Practice, amongst others. She's a stellar academic. And before she joined STOAS, Anna worked at the Centre on Migration Policy and Society and the Refugee Studies Centre at the University of Oxford. So will you join me in welcoming our amazing crew tonight? Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many of you out on this dark evening to talk about what's often quite a dark topic. My question of migration narratives can be quite toxic, and we often see narratives around migration in the media that are quite toxic, others much more positive, and some efforts that we're going to discuss at nuance and at getting to the bottom of what's going on and kind of reframing the narrative. So today we're going to hear from people with a range of perspectives, people working from the legal perspective, working in the media, in research and in human rights. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome our panel. I'm going to introduce them one by one, and then we will take their contributions in that order. So first of all, it's great to have Zehrah Hasan with us. She's going to be joining us online. She practices in immigration, asylum and public law, and she's got particular expertise around detention challenges and trafficking, among other areas. She previously worked as the advocacy director for the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants, a really key role, and in campaigning roles in Liberty and in Southall Black Sisters. So Zehrah is also the founding director of the Black Protest Legal Support. So a wealth of insight and knowledge there. She's going to talk about legal perspectives and obstacles facing migrants and the way that we're at a critical juncture now with the new government and her impressions around directions of travel. Over to you, Zehrah.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for inviting me here today. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person, but very grateful for organising my attendance remotely. So when we talk about reframing migration narratives, I think it's really crucial as a starting point to distill who exactly we are talking about when we say migrant communities, and how different groups are perceived within that broad brush term in the media, in policy, in law, and in public discourse. And so the kind of broad theme for my contribution this evening is categorization and collectivization and the impact this has on migrant communities. And in framing the issue in this way, I want to pose three key questions. Firstly, how are migrants categorized and labeled in the media, policy, and in the legal system? And secondly, how does this categorization feed into far-right discourse? And thirdly, how can collectivization as an alternative be a positive tool for organising around migrant justice. So looking at the first point, migrant communities in the UK are often subjected to oppressive and restrictive forms of categorisation by all institutions that they encounter, and even by organisations that seek to advocate for them in some way. The law will classify someone depending on the type of application they are making, whether it's for asylum, a student visa, a work visa, their partnership or family life. And the Home Office and the courts will then mediate and determine what legal category someone falls into. For example, whether they're considered a so-called foreign national offender, so as to try and justify their detention or deportation, whether they are or are not considered a refugee, whether they should have the right to work or study, and whether their family or relational ties are strong enough to justify them on a legal basis staying in the UK. In my view, this complex web of law, policy, and enforcement functions on the basis that the political and legal systems become the final arbiters of people's realities. Whole communities are divided up into boxes and forced to live within them. Even in accessing services within the charity and NGO sectors, people are forced to self-categorize to access the specific and appropriate service that meets their needs at that time. But these categories, which are created by the legal system and the political establishment, cannot and will not reflect the reality and complexity of people's histories and experiences. As Audre Lorde put it, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I think this is a vital idea to keep bringing ourselves back to as migrant communities or people organising and working to advance migrant rights. To what extent do we strip people of their agency by trying to silo their existence? As an immigration and asylum barrister, I see this in my work every day. I've represented queer people seeking asylum who came to the UK on a student visa. I've represented a queer couple recently who got refugee status, who came to the UK on the seasonal worker scheme. I've represented people applying to stay in the UK as the carer of a British partner, but who have complex histories of domestic violence and trafficking. Ultimately, the application they're making usually does not mirror the totality of their migration experience. In fact, so many migrants will have experiences of different parts of the system at different times and for different reasons. And I think this is something that's not fully appreciated and understood outside of migrant communities themselves and those working with them at the front lines. In my view, the distinction between migrant and refugee, or even subsets of migrants, is often futile and can be harmful. And the over-categorization we're seeing in the media, in policy, and within the law upholds the ever-increasing hostility, violence, and oppression inherent to the UK's border regime. So looking at my second question, how have we seen the direct impact of this categorization in far-right discourse? Well, the last government's fixation on labeling people who have been forced to cross the channel, which is a political choice in itself, as economic migrants, manufactured consent for some of the most brutal immigration policies and practices we have seen in recent years, including people being held in horrific conditions at the Manston camp, people being forced to live on the floating prison barge, and of course the threat of the Rwanda scheme, which despite ultimately being defeated, had pervasive mental health impacts on the lives of people threatened with removal there. We have continued to see this in the way the current Labour government is treating migrants. Since it came to power in July, at least 3,600 people have been deported to various countries. This includes around 40 people who were deported in October this year to Nigeria and Ghana, the highest number of people sent to those countries on a deportation flight. As one person on that flight said, the Home Office is playing politics with people's lives. We also found out just this week that the Home Office has deported 600 people to Brazil, including children who may have spent most of their lives in the UK. Again, this has been framed by the Labour government as people who engaged in the voluntary return scheme following so-called failed claims, but there is nothing voluntary about any deportation flight. One woman who was a survivor of domestic violence with 2 children, one of whom was disabled, was not granted leave to remain in the UK as a survivor of domestic violence. And she, for example, felt she had no choice but to go back to Brazil. These are the stories and experiences of people being subjected to the sharpest edges of the border regime. And Labour is well and truly carrying the flame of oppressive migration policy, but doing it under the guise of what they say is efficient control. We've also, unfortunately, seen these discourses seep into the migrants' rights sector and mainstream media, including positioning people as genuine refugees or pitting groups of migrants against each other to frame some as deserving whilst others are considered less so. This is often coupled with ideas of vulnerability and criminality, which of course are mediated by the politics of gender, race, and class. We also too often hear migrants being referred to as commodities, where ideas of integration or contribution become central to what benefit people bring. We see this particularly for migrant health and social care workers and agricultural workers. And in my view, this is exploitative in itself and lends itself again to the idea that people have to earn or prove their right to cross the border. The reality is there are many reasons people move to the UK, many of which are a direct consequence of the colonial, imperialist, and extractive exploits of this country. The largest nationalities, for example, coming to the UK in the year ending June 2024 were nationals from India, Nigeria, and Pakistan under worker or student routes, all places which are former colonies of Britain and places where English is a widely spoken first or second language. Whilst the number of people crossing the Channel are a small fraction of overall migration to the UK, again, the main communities forced to make those journeys are Afghans, Iranians, Syrians, and Vietnamese. Again, people whose countries have been at the sharpest edge of Western imperialism. So whether people are coming to the UK for work, study, safety, family, and/or community, we need to resist the categorization of migrant communities, which has been used by the far right to enact violence, by politicians to create cruel new laws and policies, and which is being used to ramp up the violent deportation regime. So just in closing, in terms of collectivization, I would love for us to move away from the language of categorization and towards collectivization. And the key difference here is that, in my view, this centers the connectedness and solidarity between different experiences and struggles rather than siloing people into groups. For example, organizing alongside migrant workers and understanding them through their relationship to worker exploitation in the UK can be really powerful. And we've seen this with the growing grassroots resistance to immigration raids on courier drivers and in other workplaces. But we must understand a migrant worker could also be a refugee, could also be a student, a carer, a family member, or someone who's criminalized and detained, and many other things as part of their journey. We also have to continue to organize along the lines of gender, racial liberation, queer and trans rights, and disability justice to understand how people's experiences can be compounded by multiple and intersecting forms of oppression. So if we understand people through the lens of their experiences, rather than these rigid legal categories, we can properly start to create the realities we want to see. Ultimately, the border regime in the UK is a system built for profit and control, not for people or for care. And if we can understand and talk about migration through the prism of these wider systems of harm that govern people's experiences, including capital extraction, labor control, racial social ordering, and imperialism, We can talk about migration in a way that reflects people's political realities and struggles. And it's only by understanding this ourselves that we can begin to undo its sharpest edges and dismantle it as a whole. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sara. It's fantastic to hear a lawyer challenging the question of legal categories, actually. And I love how you were talking about how kind of the ways that policy categories work to put people in neat boxes, to kind of divide and manage, but inevitably kind of like oversimplifying, homogenizing the lived experiences and the ways people understand their own migration trajectories and all those layers of history and the structural forces lying behind that. Really helpful. Thank you. So we're going to turn now to a perspective from someone who has a long-standing involvement in migrant rights through communications roles and the media. So Emiliano Mellino is an award-winning journalist working for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and he specialises very much in worker and migrants' rights. Over the last 2 years, he's been investigating exploitation of migrant workers in agricultural and care sectors and looking at how the UK's border regime contributes to their exploitation. And he's particularly going to focus on the post-Brexit work visa system and the patterns of exploitation within that, and with some observations on media reporting around these issues.
See how much I go off script. It's a very messy script anyway, so I will do the best. Microphone, please. Push. How about now?
You can have mine.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, I'm gonna start off talking a bit about the work we've done and maybe a couple of reflections at the end about maybe even a little bit of a criticism as well about the work I've done, and how to think about moving forward in terms of how we report and we talk about migrant work and so on, and journalism and the rest. So yeah, over the last couple of years, I've done a lot of work on two specific visas: the seasonal worker visa and the health and care visa. Now, these are both brought in post-Brexit because of labor shortages in both of these sectors. These were sectors that traditionally were staffed also by migrant workers, but migrant workers who came into the UK through freedom of movement, mainly through Eastern Europe. And both of those visas share the fact that they are what we call tied visas, which effectively your immigration status depends on either, in the case of the health and care visa, on your employer, in the case of the seasonal worker visa, on your recruiter. Now, even before the creation of these visas, a lot of labor rights organizations and modern slavery organizations and human rights organizations were warning that by tying a visa to someone's employer or someone's recruiter, you substantially increase the chances of this person being exploited, because you're giving this recruiter, you're giving this employer much more power. You give them the power not only for the person to lose their job, but to lose their immigration status. And it's kind of quite straightforward how this puts people in situations of vulnerability, right? And creates complete, already there's a power imbalance in the employer-employee relationship. When that employer also has power over your visa, that power imbalance is much greater. So these warnings were made by a number of people. Obviously, these warnings were not heeded to. These visas were created without sufficient safeguards. And what we found over the years is, I think, more so with the health and care visa, but also with the seasonal worker visa, is that people are being exploited, mistreated, abused in quite a broad way and in quite a dramatic way. So, I had some notes about some issues, but I think maybe I'll tell you a few stories instead of people. I think that's probably the best way to approach this. So I'll tell you a story about one of the workers, one of the earlier workers I've met who came on the seasonal worker visa. His name was Zehrah. He came from Nepal. He paid a couple thousand, if I remember correctly, a couple thousand, maybe £3,000 in recruitment fees to a recruiter to come to the UK on this visa. Now, in theory, paying recruiters, recruiters shouldn't charge you in the UK. It's illegal for recruiters to charge you for work. But the chain of recruiters, there's so many subcontractors within the chain that this gets lost. So a recruiter in Nepal charged him. This recruiter in Nepal was potentially subcontracted by the British recruiter. There's been no consequence for either of them, even though these practices are supposed to be illegal. So he came to the UK and he went to work in a farm in Kent, picking apples and sell fruits. And, you know, the farm was very happy with him. He was a very effective worker. He did very well. 6 weeks into his placement in this farm, 6 weeks after he arrived to the UK, him and a bunch of other Nepali workers were told, well, look, there's no work left for you. You're going to have to go back to Nepal. And they said, well, no, we're still in debt. We haven't paid back, you know, we haven't paid back a fraction of what we paid in terms of recruitment fees, in terms of flights and so on and so forth. You know, in terms of what we're paying now in rent to the farm, because that's another aspect. These workers, they also live on the farm. They pay rent to the farmer that employs them to live on the farm in these not very nice caravans, which we can go into a bit later. So they said, no, we're not going to go. And then the recruiter said, no, you have to go. And then the recruiter started threatening them. And there are a number of emails which I've seen and which I've reported on where the recruiter starts to tell them, well, if you guys don't leave, we're going to blacklist you. And you're never going to come back to the UK. And you're never going to work in farms ever again. And so this is, again, this is a manifestation of the power these recruiters have because of the power they have over the visa and people's immigration status. And eventually, most of these guys left under these threats because they thought, well, look, I'm not going to be able to pay this back now, but maybe if I come back next year, I'll be able to pay it back. He never came back. Last time I spoke to him, and granted, this was a long time ago because this story was from a while ago. It was a year after that I spoke to him again. He still had not paid back his debts that he got into to come to the UK. The problems Syria face are not unique in any way. These are very common problems, and there's other problems in the scheme, right? There's problems of people not being paid what they're owed. Of course, these huge deductions workers pay for accommodation, accommodations that's just not fit for staff, you know, just not fit for human habitation. Another guy I know on the scheme, Vajim, he was in a farm. He actually worked in the pack house of a farm. So basically putting the vegetables and the fruit and so on into packaging. He was in an incredibly cold caravan over winter, autumn, late autumn, November, a couple of years ago. It was a very cold autumn. And he showed me the thermostat on this electric heater. It said 8 degrees. He was living in this caravan at 8 degrees. He said some nights, he didn't know if he was going to wake up in the morning. He was so scared of dying because of how cold it was. And as you know, you might not know, anything below 10 degrees puts you at risk of hypothermia. He obviously complained about this to the farm, and the manager, after a few complaints, gave him, because he had all these, there was all these vents in this caravan. This uninsulated caravan had all these vents, so wind would come in, would seep through. And he complained about this, and the manager gave him some duct tape and told him, not duct tape, sorry, packing tape, and told him just tape it up. And he showed me some pictures of these taped up vents, but obviously that doesn't do much. And, you know, there was mold, there were even plants growing from the windowsill because they were so dirty and it was so damp. And yeah, it was truly a horrific and dirty. It was really a horrific caravan he was living in. And despite his complaints, nothing was done about it. There's issues of threats. These threats I mentioned before that Syria had of being told, you know, if you don't leave, you're going to be blacklisted. These sorts of threats are very common. Or even threats that people are told, you know, if people are complaining, they said, well, if you keep on complaining, you know what, we're just going to send you back. Or they say, you know, more indirectly, you're not happy, go back home. But the implication is clear. Or, for example, sorry, I know I'm a bit all over the place. My notes are a bit of a mess. I didn't really prepare too much. This a lot of it from memory, but you know, bear with me. You know, we imagine, you know, we see the countryside. We imagine, you know, the sound of music. You know, nuns running around the hills, but it's not like that. These farms, especially in horticulture, where there's like soft fruits, you know, raspberry, blueberries, these kinds of things, even cherries. They're effectively factories, but outdoor. The way the production line works is with incredible pressure on people to work quickly and at speed, to pick as much weight as possible in as quickly as possible. So workers are constantly being pressured. So a lot of the workers were telling me that they would be shouted at, they would be insulted, and constantly being pressured by the supervisors to pick faster and faster and faster. And failure to pick the amount of weight that you required would result in punishments. And one of the punishments, one of the most common punishments, is that you are then denied work. So what you're told, around, you do a couple hours of the shift, and then the supervisor will say, well, you guys, you three, you've not been fast enough, you're going back to the caravan. And if you go back to the caravan, you do not get paid for the rest of the day. And so I mentioned before, these guys have debts, and if you don't get paid for the rest of the day, it means you can't get paid back your debt. So this is a very strong, this is a very powerful threat that these workers are facing, and there's a very powerful punishment that these workers face. I realize I've gone way over time. I haven't gotten into the health and care visa, but I just want to finish a couple of points on this. Oh, and a final thing, a lot of these farms, they don't call people by their names, they call them by their work number. So a lot of workers were saying, it's like being in prison, they'll tell you, 375, go back to your caravan. They don't even call you by name. So it's incredibly dehumanizing experience. And it's an incredibly common practice. I remember when I asked one farm about it, when we do journalism, after we finish our research and we write the article, we give the people we're making accusations against, we give them the chance to respond. It's called a right of reply. So I write to these farms and I ask them, you guys are calling people by a number. People say they feel dehumanized. They feel like they're in prison. And the farm responds, oh yeah, no, that's fine. All farms do that. We're not doing it to dehumanize them. It's just a common business practice. So that's how blasé they are about it. And this is how common this practice is. Couple of things. We also got our hands on a bunch of home office inspection reports, because the home office goes in some of these farms. And we found hundreds of complaints by workers in these home office inspection reports. On average, 1 of every 2 workers had some kind of complaint. There was complaints of a person saying they couldn't get medical treatment, so they pulled out their own teeth because they couldn't get a dentist. A woman that would have effectively been imprisoned in her caravan because when she had COVID and they wouldn't let her go out to get food or anything. I mentioned the threats, the wage theft, the poor housing, and recruitment fees as much as £7,500. Hundreds of allegations in these home office inspection reports. Between 2021 and 2022, not a single one of those allegations were then inspected by the home office. Not a single one. No action was taken. Oh, okay, health and care visa. It's even worse. But I think I'm just going to say the recruitment fees in the health and care visa are as much as £25,000. £25,000 people pay to come to the UK. And often people find that when they arrive in the UK, after they pay the recruitment fees, they're not getting any work. The employers basically scammed them. They paid the employer these recruitment fees, and then there's no work when they arrive. It's a wholesale scam going on in the health and care sector. And because of that thing I was mentioning about the visa being tied, people do not complain, because they know that if they complain, they're going to lose their visa. And it works in a very insidious way, because not only is there a risk of losing your visa because your employer might fire you and therefore you lose your visa, there's a risk of you losing your visa because what happens when you complain to the home office with the health and care visa, when you complain to the home office, what the home office does is it revokes your employer's sponsor license, which is what gives them the right to sponsor you as a worker and sponsor your visa as a worker. So if you complain to the home office removes your employer's right to sponsor you, and therefore you lose your visa. So if you complain to the home office, you lose your visa. If you complain to the home office about how you're being treated by your employer, you lose your visa. And we did a freedom of information request, and we found that between 2022 and 2023, 3,000 care workers lost their visas, lost what's called their certificate of sponsorship, because a license was revoked, because the home office revoked that employer's sponsor license. So it's a very real threat that these workers are under. And the home office is completely complicit in this. I'm sorry if I'm going a bit fast, a bit all over the place. Feel free to ask me to clarify anything. I'm going to stop that. I'm not going to talk about the more broader comm stuff at the moment because I've gone way over.
We can come back to that, Emiliano.
Yeah, sorry.
Really interesting to see, these are the sectors you're talking about are critical sectors of the economy where the government has recognized the need for legal recruitment and created schemes for that. And yet you're presenting these really kind of vivid accounts of the issues in those sectors. And it's striking how invisible a lot of this work is, how it's done on farms or inside care homes and so on. And actually, it's a really good point to turn to Simona, because I know you're going to talk more about the structural forces driving migration, labour market impacts, and some of the damaging impact of securitisation on migrant workers.
Yeah, okay, let's bring it a bit broader here, because I'm an academic, so I like to do abstract and broad things.
Leila, sorry, Simona, I am so sorry I haven't introduced you properly. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Simona Talani. She's Talani of International Political Economy at the Department of European and International Studies at King's College in London since 2014.
I'm professor since 2014, but at King's since many more years.
Many more years, okay. And she's the editor...
Don't add up.
She's editor of a book series focusing on the politics of citizenship and migration, and is the founding director of the Centre for Italian Politics at EIS at King's College. She's been appointed Jean Monnet, Chair of European Political Economy by the European Commission in 2012. Over to you, Simona.
Yeah, if you read all the titles, we never finish, so we don't. So basically the whole idea is taking it a little bit broader. I wouldn't say that we need to change the narratives. We really need to change the policies. It's a bit like, although legal boxes can be annoying, legal boxes will actually determine what people eventually end up doing or end up being cited. I will make you examples of people who are really mainstream and very neoliberal economists who actually achieve exactly the same conclusion, reach exactly the same kind of conclusion. Why this? Because migration nowadays, although I mean the usual premise is that basically migration has always existed, it's true, but it's not always been the same. Migration nowadays is a consequence of Marx would call the change in the mode of production. So it's a consequence of the neoliberal globalization process, which has some characteristics which are very, in a way, unique, because this mode of production is different from the previous ones and has got some very specific elements in it, of which one of the most evident is the fact that you can produce globally. So you do not need to stick to a certain territory to produce, but you can produce at the global level. And this is not because people have changed their mentality, but because technology has made it possible, and has made it possible at a profit. If it were not profitable, capitalists would not use this mode of production, but it's absolutely profitable, and they use it only because technology allows it. We can elaborate, but it would take too long, so I'm not going to elaborate on this. What happens, however, because globalization is global, it impacts everyone, and it impacts everyone in different ways. So there are some regions in the globe which are more integrated in the global political economy, and these are, I mean, there are, even though they are more integrated, but not as integrated as people believe, because if you look at the data, especially the structured ones, even China, which is supposed to be incredibly integrated, gets only 11% of the global stock of FDIs. So we're not talking about the huge integration. We're talking about an increase in integration into the global political economy, which leaves many disintegrating from the global political economy. And this is random, is related to various reasons which we can discuss. All of these belong to what is normally called the global south. If you're less and less integrated in the global political economy, and there are the data which I don't need to show you now, what happens is that you have an increased incentive to leave your country. And I talk about economic migration here. We can talk, political migration and refugees different, although at the end of the day, they're not so different because migrants, even refugees need to be most of the time irregular migrants to enter a safe country and then ask for the asylum seeking status, which makes them all together. At the same time, economic migrants actually need to ask for the asylum seeking status if they want to get some form of legal recognition. They might not get it, but at least they can ask and stay physically in the territory until when they disappear and become irregular, but they at least enter the place, which is, we can discuss this as well. Anyways, the point is this, that you have an increased incentive to move abroad if you belong to the global south. And this does not apply only to the unskilled labor, but also to skilled. If you look at the data, this is actually happening. The case of my case study is the European Union. The European Union did not have a problem of migration until the 80s. Actually, countries which are now recognized are countries of immigration. They used to be countries of immigration, big time, including mine, because I'm Italian. And here we have an example of an Argentinian who comes from Italy and is clearly an example of emigration of Italians. Italians emigrated. They actually still do emigrate a lot, but we also have, we are still a net immigration country. Italy became a net immigration country since 2016, but we have immigrants now, which we didn't used to have before. That all means that there are the proofs of the fact that this is an event, I mean, a tendency or a trend which has been happening in the last 40 years, which is precisely from the start of globalization. How did we react to this structural increase of migration from the global south? Anyone can answer? Did we tell them, you're more than welcome to come here, please have your seat at the table? Did we say so? Anyone wants to answer from the audience? No, we reacted by closing the borders big time through what is called, in the jargon, securitization of migration. Securitization of migration is the only form of migration policy that exists in the European Union. I have the impression it's the same in the UK, but your reader here can confirm. But because there is no other way, 95% of migrants that enter the European Union nowadays is illegal at some point of their migration process, which means you might not be illegal. The United Nations actually divide between various forms of entry. So there is the illegal, legal, indentured, and so on. So basically it means that you can enter illegally and then become legal after. You can enter illegally and remain. Illegal is a term can be used. It's not it's the reality. So I like to use it, could be irregular, but it's illegal in reality. Illegal, you enter illegally, you stay illegally. You can enter legally with the famous student's visa or family reconjunction or reunification visa, or even with an employment visa, and then become illegal when you lose the status, which means, for example, when you lose the status as an employee, which is the norm. It happens even for bureaucratic reasons, that you might have even found another job, but for bureaucratic reason, in the meantime, while your documents are being made, you become illegal. So it's all a very complicated system. So just to say that the vast majority, talking about the almost totality of migrants that enter the European Union at the moment, are irregular at some point or will become irregular at some point. Securitization is not a good idea. First, because it doesn't stop them. It's evident and clear that despite the fact that we are closing the border and creating the Fortress Europe, adopting more stricter and stricter policies, the number of migrants increases and it does not decrease. So it is proved that this doesn't work. And not only this, the number of irregular migrants increase, which is the proof of the fact that the famous policy gap exists. And if you are a little bit of an expert of migration, the policy gap is when you basically the intending consequence of your policies are not achieved. The intending consequence is stop migrants, you don't stop them. That means that there is a policy gap. You don't stop them, but you transform them from regular to irregular. So crossing the border makes, increase in security at the border does not stop migrants, but transforms them from regular migrants into irregular migrants. This is done only because of the law. The law is the only thing that changes your status, despite the fact we don't like to say it. If the law changes, also your status changes. So if the law is not strict anymore, then you become legal. Actually, there are categories of migrants which are legally legal. In transit countries, they're legal, then they become illegal, and then they become legal in other countries. So it's only a legal concept, this one. It's nothing to do with you at all, nothing to do with nothing. It's just a legal concept. Securitization is a problem, transforms migrants. I'm going to finish now. How much do I have? 3 more minutes. Oh, so I'm very quick, to be honest. So it transforms migrants into irregular migrants. Is this good or bad? Well, in theory, this is really, really bad because whereas regular migrants, they all contribute to the economy of receiving countries. This is proved. Both irregular migrants and regular migrants, they all contribute because they increase the GDP. They increase the GDP almost by definition because they work. And by working, you increase the GDP. It is, and many people believe that they come here and steal our jobs. This is simply impossible because the moment in which you have an increase in the number of people who work, you have an increase in the big cake that we have distributing. So if the cake is like this, when there are only 100,000 people working, there are the cake to distribute become like this when there are 1 million people working. So it's not me to say it, it's professors at Harvard who are total neoliberal economists. I can give you the name, Professor Perry, Professor Freeman, there are so many. Professor Portes, who is one of my, Jonathan Portes, who had the Kings with me. They are all economists, they are all neoliberal economists, and there is not a single one who does not agree that increasing migration, increasing growth and productivity. We can discuss the reasons. There is basically no competition, not even reduction of lowering of the wages of the local population if the migrants are regular. In that case, the difference is, however, is that irregular migrants create more problems to themselves for obvious reasons, so they suffer more, they are more exploitable, they are more exploited, they are more blackmailable, they are more blackmailed, as our colleague was just saying. This is just the proof that this happens. However, they also create problems to the local population. For example, irregular migration does lower the wages of the local population simply because there is no limit to how much they can be exploited, so there is real possibility of actually being enslaved, or almost, they talk about modern slaves. So it is all completely true. There is also the problem that these people are criminalized. They are not only criminalized because they don't like them, but also because there is actually the crime of irregular migration in Europe. All countries in Europe have a crime, so it is a criminal offense to enter the country irregularly, which means by definition you're criminalized. You are a criminal by definition. When you're a criminal by definition, then you can become a criminal in reality as well. But there is also the problem of organized crime, because how do you think that these people can cross the border without having the documents, apart from the trafficking, which is a different thing? What does that mean? That then they become indentured to organized crime. They have to pay debts, but they don't have to pay debts to some company or farm. They have to pay debts to organized crime, which is slightly more dangerous. So they have to do it. And this is not nice, even for the local population, because organized crime becomes a problem also for local population. So you have criminalization, marginalization, increased incentive to misbehave on the side of the migrants, and even, I have to say, some incentive to react, which could be like through the forms of either violent outbursts. We've seen what happened here very recently in this country, or even terrorism. So there could be, not that I'm not saying that migrants are terrorists, but you give them a higher incentive if you don't treat them well, and there are instances of similar things. So at the end of the story, there is only one way to resolve this problem, which is to legalize migration and then open the borders for migrants, which are actually needed by not only the increased growth and productivity in general, but in particular in countries like the European Union ones and the UK, where there is a shortage of labor and there is an aging population. So the reality, the fact is that migrants, irregular migrants are absolutely, migrants in general are needed. They are so needed that irregular migrants, all of them find jobs and all of them work. If they were regular, all of them find jobs and all of them would work, and they do the jobs that the local population doesn't want to do. All of this is actually proved. I'm publishing a book precisely about this, which is called The Migration Question, coming out in 2024, 2025. And is trying to give answers to basically debunk the myths of globalization. Do they come here? Do they steal our job? Why do they come here? Are they all terrorists? Are they all criminals and stuff like this? So that's the idea. I know that it's been very quick and there are so many things to talk and I couldn't say it, but I'll leave the floor for questions whenever you have.
Thanks.
No problem.
Putting some of those reviewed accounts in a more global historical perspective. Sorry, thanks, Simona, for putting those kind of vivid accounts from Emiliano in a more global and historical perspective, and these forces that are driving migration, and kind of also putting what's happening on this small island in a bit more perspective as well. So now we're turning to Sara Alsherif, who works as program manager for Migrants Digital Justice Project at the Open Rights Group. She's a human rights defender and a researcher in digital rights, has a master's degree in digital media from the University of Sussex, and is currently a PhD candidate there. And I know, you know, those of you who are here on visas or who are working with people here on visas will be acutely aware that the government is currently rolling out its e-visa program. This is something that Sara and Open Rights Group have worked on a lot. They've just published a report called Broken and Hostile. She's going to talk a bit about the unfolding of that scheme and some of the alternatives to it and some of the ways of combating this. So over to you, Sara.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I would like to highlight before just jumping to the digitalizations and the e-visa scheme that the government want to roll it out, and they just yesterday they decided to postpone it to April. Thank God for this. So just so we are pushing the disaster to April now. But before we start talking on this, I'd like to highlight in a way to change the narrative around talking about migration, we should change the words around how we describe migrants. So it's whatever the government or whatever the states are adopting the language, we shouldn't use their same language, because they are working on a hostile environment to create such a hostile environment, and this is what they said clearly. So we should know that even with what they say, illegal migrants or regular migrants, we should know that every possible route is a legal route. And government the UK government didn't provide a safe route for the migrants or for refugees to come to the UK. And it always, and it will be always, and will stay that the freedom of movement is right. Migrating is right. British people migrate to different places to find a good opportunities and to find a good places to live and to have a good income. And we should know that the migration policy or system in the UK is inherently loaded with racism, starting from labeling the migration system with EUSS visa. So it's for the European citizens, and for e-visa for the rest of the world. It's making a separation between two categorizations of people. So we should be aware of while we are using this kind of terms and words. And starting from what Leila finished, she said, with the law, it can change your visa. It can turn your life from being a regular in the eyes of the government or the status to the eye of the being obedient citizens and good citizen according to the government system or the government definitions. And now the law is becoming digital, and everything is digital. So what tells the story of migrants is the digitalizations. And this is what the government now is working on, trying to moving to everything digital. And for this, they introduced something called an e-visa scheme. E-visa scheme, if you are familiar with if you are migrants or you are having a migrant friends or whatever. So people here, if they are not British, if they are not Irish, and if they are not from the EU, they have to have a PRB. Or so they will have indefinite leave to remain or leave to remain, and they will have a PRB. This PRB enable them to enroll in education, enable them to claim benefits. Through this PRB, they can get a share code to have rent or work, and it's guarantees them to re-enter the border. So in every time they come to the UK, they have to present this PRB. The government introduced 5 years ago. They decided that the deadline for the PRP will be 30 of December 2024. This was the former government, conservative government. They decided like apart of what before the Brexit that they will get rid of the PRP. After the Brexit, they didn't back off this kind of plan. So it was 5 years ago when they decided to get rid of BRP, but it's only this April 2024 when they started to send an invitation for people to create a UKVI account, which enables them to link their status on the internet to their UKVI account, so they can see like they have the right to work, they have the right to be in the UK, and it enables them to it's like a kind of verifying that they are still here. To have iPhone 7 or newer, according to the Home Office website. You have to have Android system able to make a contactless payment. If you don't have these two things, you will not be able to create a UKVI account. And this is not only, if you pass this condition, you have to have email, you have to have a British number. Then you can create your UKVI account. So people, when they started to get this invitation, of course, not all of them having this kind of technology, and the Home Office saying something so interestingly, like if you don't have this technology or this mobile, borrow it from your friend or your family, close family, which is like it makes you like. People who put this system in place, they know nothing about migrant or refugees who are living in the UK. They know nothing about vulnerable communities or vulnerable people. They know nothing about like being a victim of domestic abuse or not be having an agency over your email or over your number. Then if you passed all these conditions, this is not a guarantee that you can see your data, because even after you receiving an email confirming that you already created your UKVI account successfully, people started to see like they are not able to access their account online. There is an error message, and sometimes they successfully can open their e-visa account, but see different information. So people, for example, like have a multiple application. What they are seeing on their e-visa account online is an old visa, not the new one, which means like they don't have right to work and they can be deported anytime. This how the narrative being done by the government. So despite that you have the right to the UK, if the digital systems say you are not, this is the story that the government or the state will stick to. And this kind of the issue that it happened when you create a UKVI account, people can see wrong information. There is something called tangling identity. So you can see different information for someone else. You can see an old application, but the government said like after you create UKVI account, you have to link your passport to the e-visa, to the online e-visa. So in the airport, you have to international carriers. It's not in the British airport. They will check your passport, and according to somehow unknown software, the international carrier will be able to check your passport or your information and receive a message from the Home Office that you have the right to be in the UK. If you don't link your passport, you will not be able to re-enter UK. And sometimes the international carrier, they said like you can get a share code valid for 3 months and to show it to the international carrier in the airport, and they will run it to the Home Office server. So they make sure that you have the right to re-enter or to board on the flight. Sometimes they said like you will have sometimes to sign into your e-visa account in the airport to show it to the international carriers. This means that you have to sign to use unsecure internet connection. You have to have actually charged smartphone in the airport. You have to have your access to your email and your British number to get the credentials and to put it in your e-visa account. So this is a 3 variables. And if you encounter any problems in the international airport, there is a hotline working from 9 to 5, except the holidays, according to the British time. So please don't travel unless you make sure like the hotline is working. So, and the service only in English, despite it's targeting the migrants who their language might not be the English one. So this is not the end. So if you succeeded to link your passport to the UKVI account, it doesn't mean that the international carrier already agreed to deal with the e-visa and not asking you for any physical document, because there is a trouble, because the UK said like, if any international carrier put on the plane to the UK, anyone don't have the right to enter to the UK, there is a high penalty on the international carrier. So it will be easier for them. If the software doesn't work, if the internet not working, if the share code gives them a wrong information, they will have the right to say no. It's like it's more secure for the international carrier. It's work in their benefits not to let you board on this flight. And we already started to see problems like people going to the bank and applying for a loan, and while they are working on their application, the bank asked them for proof that they have the right to be in the UK, the e-visa, and they asked for an e-visa, not for the PRP, because the PRP saying like it will end at 31st of December 2024, so they need a proof that they will have the right to be more than this after this dates in the UK. They can't access e-visa, so they are stuck with the online with the loan application. People coming from different countries as students and being stopped in the airport because in transit, because their visa will end in 31st of December and they don't have an e-visa yet, so the airlines refuse to let them board on these flights. We saw this happen before. And before I finished with the international carriers, I'd like to say, like, while the government or the Home Office designed this system to link the passport, the migrant passport to their UKVI account, if you are a refugee, you will not be able to link your travel document who already issued from the UK to your UKVI account, which means that you don't have any online proof to show it to the international carriers that you have the right to enter to the UK, because you will have a mismatching information from the country that issued this passport and your nationality. Because like refugees who are coming to the UK and didn't get the British citizenship yet, usually issued with a UN document from the UK or from European countries. So refugees will not be able to link their travel documents to the UKVI account, which means that they will be stranded abroad in foreign international airport without any place to go because they can't back to their countries. So whoever who designed this system, they didn't think for a minute about a full cohort of refugees who are living in the UK or having the right to live in the UK. This has happened before, not without the digitalizations. It's the law who changing your status, like for people who lived for 30 years and born and just like worked and create a family in the UK, and suddenly because of a new system and a new laws, they lost all this kind of rights. We see this in the Windrush, and the e-visa with the e-visa system, it's kind of recreating the same crisis digitally. This we started like as has been said, we issued a report called Hostile and Broken, highlighting all this problem. We have been in conversations and meeting with the Home Office many times, asking them to tell us how this system will work, because this system is basically not working because it's an online system. It's not a digital system. Your status on the internet or on the clouds, it's something that you can download it, you can save it. It's not stable. So every time you sign in to your e-visa account, it's kind of like a lottery. So you might see your information, the system might be working at this time, or it might not be working. It's according to your luck. And this is what it's called digital hostile environment, keeping people in fear and in terror. It's mental torture, like to think like every time that you have to say something to prove that you have the right to be in the UK. And it usually, when something happens with the share code, when you have the right to rent, or when you apply for the work, if something went wrong, you always have your PRP document in your hand. You could approve it, you could show it, which is give you the agency over your story that you have the right to be in the UK. But now, with stripping full cohort like migrants in the UK from this kind of document, it's taking their story from them. They even asking people with legacy document who already been in the UK for 50 years and they don't have a PRP, and sometimes they usually old people, they don't have a passport, to approve where they are over 30 years to be able to get a PRP, then to move to the UK VI account. So thankfully, just less than months, and after a lot of publicity and campaign, yesterday Home Office announced that they will not rule where people travel going to somewhere. A lot of migrants didn't know even about the e-visa. That there was no budget or campaign to reach everyone. They started to announce and to make a media campaign in September 2024, just like 4 months before the rolling out. So now they moved the deadline to April 2024, but this will not solve the problem. 2025. This will not solve the problem. The problem is still there. We don't want a digital-only status. We don't want an online status. We need something stable. We need something that people can print. We need something that having a hard copy, people who already don't have the digital literacy can print it, can have it with them. We need an inclusion system. We need an inclusivity, actually. A system can include everyone and everyone can use it. And that's it.
Thank you very much.
Just wanted to clarify one point. The EU settled status is also going e-visa. So also the European Union citizens will have this applied exactly the same system. Because there is a huge movement against these amongst all of the Europeans, the 3 million and so on. So it's not true that the European Union citizens will be treated differently. They're going to be treated
Actually, they are treated differently because during the rollout of the EU's SS, it has more than 1 month or 9 months. To rule the e-visa now, they started from April. With the EU SS, it has a transitional period.
No, it's April as well. I can give you the articles. They've all been circulated amongst us.
The communication campaign, the communication budget for the Home Office was massive for the EU SS, which is not.
But the date is the same. I might have had a different.
Yeah, they have
campaign, but the date is the same, and the system is exactly the same, and the level of frustration with the EU citizen is exactly the same. I can tell you.
Disagree, but it's okay.
It's great to hear. You were talking about how easy it is for people to fall out of status to become unauthorized, and actually now you're talking about how hard it can be for people to prove that they've got legal status in this country. And I think some of those stories, like you said, were no surprise to anyone familiar with offline Home Office record keeping. The lost asylum files, the issues around Windrush generation, all the glitches. So I mean, I was already apprehensive about seeing that system go online, and I guess now I'm even more apprehensive. But it's just fantastic to have all these perspectives. I'm conscious we need to turn this over to the room, and I know that many of you will have questions for the speakers, reflections on the perspectives that they've brought. So we've got Zehrah here, we've got Simona, we've got Emiliano and Sara. So make the most of this. Have we got any questions or reflections? Yeah.
Sorry, can you use microphones, please? Yeah, so I was saying thank you to every contributor and to Anna for organizing. It was very interesting. I'm a student of Anna's, and I've also worked with Syrian refugees in Paris and in Beirut, Lebanon. And my question was more towards, I've had a bit of experience working with migrant workers in Lebanon, but I'm not as familiar with the British context. And you were mentioning that the new health worker and care worker visas were tied to the employers. And I really wonder why did the UK do this when there's been like so much documentation about abuses with the kafala system in the Middle East? And what were the alternatives that were discussed, if any?
Thank you. Let's go to Emiliano.
I mean, why does the Home Office do anything? Why does the Home Office do this? You know? I mean, I think, I to be honest, I wish I knew more about the internal thinking, but I don't think we need to know more about the internal thinking. You know, this is how the system operates, right? And I think it's part of like the whole reason why we're talking about this, about looking at the micro and the macro in terms of, you know, how the narratives then feed to the policies. They don't want people, they want workers.
Not
You know what I mean?
Not even.
You know, they want machines. And so I think that is part of why these things play out like this, because yeah, you're right, the kafala system, right? We always look at those problems abroad, you know, and we never think about they're happening here. And they repeat themselves, you know. The parallels. One of the journalists I worked with was this guy called Pete Patterson, who had worked a lot from Nepal and done a lot on Nepali migrant workers to Qatar and so on. And he was telling me, you know, it's exactly like the parallels are uncanny. You know, and he actually ended up writing a piece about how the parallels were so uncanny between these two systems. I think the question, but I would kind of repose the question. It's not so much, you know, why did they do this when they saw it was happening elsewhere and they had all these warnings? The question for me is, why do they perpetuate this? Why do there's been so many warnings, they have the data, there's been government reports, they know this is going on, and yet they look the other way. And I think it's, you know, it fits, you know, if we're going to pull out, it fits into the wider issue we face with the dehumanization of migrants in this country. And let's be honest, all over the world, the UK is not unique in this. And I think that goes to another point as well, which is, you know, it's about power as well, right? And about the fact that in the political system, migrants have less power. And obviously, as we've talked about, in the employment system, migrants have less power. Right, and maybe I'm going too much on a tangent here, but I think also when we talk about these stories as well, it is important to obviously highlight the problems, to highlight the abuse and highlight the exploitation. But I think within that highlighting of the abuse and the exploitation, there's a pitfall, and there's a pitfall that we kind of show a one-dimensional picture of migrants, and we remove agency. And one of the things I wanted to get to in the talk, and I didn't get to, was that it's also important to highlight the stories of struggle and the stories of fighting and the stories of resistance to all these systems, you know, because ultimately I don't think, yes, liberals and so on, they'll help to an extent, but I think ultimately the key here is about empowering and building power in migrant communities. So thinking about not only media that speaks to, you know, liberals and so on, because then they will campaign, but also media that speaks to other migrants, to inspire them to take action and to build power and inspire, inform, and so on and so forth, and to build action. So communication between migrants to build power and resist these sorts of things. That probably was too much of a tangent from your question, but you know.
Yeah. Sara, let's hear from you. And I can see Sara nodding a lot online, so maybe you might want to come in as well. But
Yeah, I'd like to add to what you said, like maybe the systems, they design it to work this way. But like it's always like we said, like the system is broken, the system is not broken, the system designed to work in that exactly way, as like they said it before, to create a hostile environment. And to say something else, they don't want migrants, or they don't want people, they want rich people. And this is what we saw with the Nigel Farage narratives, and to provide a safe havens for businessmen in the UK, so they can pay less tax. We saw this in the former governments when they sacked David Neal, the independent inspectors, because he wanted to publish a report about the private flights that they came and to the UK and people enter without any security clearance. So they have no problem with the securitization at this point if people have money. So they don't, and again, we have to return. I think like we should link it to in every time we discuss migration to history of racism and colonization. It's not a separate subject. Yeah.
Can I just?
Sarah, did you want to come in online? I could see you nodding a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious there might be other questions as well, so I'm happy to come in on another question if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Other questions? Yeah, over here at the back.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm not good at public speaking, so I've written this down. In regards to the ever-changing immigration rules, the Law Commission report concluded that they needed to be simplified due to their complexity, making them unworkable for not only lay people, but also those legally trained. Do you think that these have been affected by the politics and hostile environment, by the government and media and ever-changing Home Secretaries? Because I think the complexity is a direct causation of the hostile environment.
Brilliant question. Incredibly difficult to navigate the immigration rules, right? It gives lawyers a lot of headache. Sarah, would you like to come in?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the rules are ever changing and always complex, more and more complex. And I think this kind of, links quite neatly with what previous speakers have been saying about, I do think that this has been designed on purpose to push people into precarity. We're seeing that as well with, for example, the cuts to legal aid over the last 10 or more years, which have left people without legal representation. How are people meant to navigate this ever, more complicated system without a lawyer, without knowing kind of what application to even make in the first place, yet alone how to do it successfully? And I think, maybe kind of echoing what's already been said, I think we have to remember that the ways in which the immigration system becomes more complex is also part of kind of the system pushing people into precarity, which then leads to profit for whether it's the government or private companies. So, for example, when we're talking about like the previous question with agricultural workers, that's very much about increasing profit, in the direct economic production of the things that they're working on. We've seen, for example, the government raise the minimum income requirement for partner visas. That relates to, like Sara was saying, like more people who are wealthier coming into the country. We've also seen, that precarity and the fact that people can fall out of status because the rules are so complex means that they might be more likely to end up in detention centres, or they might be more likely to end up in a situation where they end up, in the asylum process, and then they're in asylum hotels. And we know that both of those systems are outsourced to private companies who are making record profits. We've seen, just in the last couple of months, Clear Springs has made 90 million in profit, and the directors entered the Times Rich List. And then we also see that the UK has some of the most expensive visa fees in Europe. So when people are on, for example, the 10-year route to settlement, they are having to renew their visa every 30 months. And those fees are now nearly £4,000 every time they renew. And so then obviously if someone can't afford it, then they're going to be pushed into not having status because they've not been able to regularize it. And we've seen research in the past that the Home Office is making 800% profit on some of these applications. So really, when we're thinking about, how not only complicated but expensive these routes are, there's a direct benefit to the state and to corporations for that, which is making money. And I think understanding it through that lens is so important, because that's the way that we're going to actually start to challenge some of this, and not simply see this as working only in the Home Office or only in the Secretary of State for the Home Department making policy. This is a much wider system where there are other people who are directly profiting off it.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes, at the back here.
Thank you for the presentations. I was just wondering whether the Department of Work and Pensions are involved in some of the working conditions of the migrants, because surely if you are working in the UK, regardless of the fact that they are migrants or refugees or asylum seekers, the workers' rights apply to everyone. And wouldn't that be an interesting way of sort of sensibilizing the public into not the migration issues, but the human rights issue in terms of the right of the worker? And I'm sure that there's no British person who would not be sympathetic to people having to pay, coming from Nepal and to live in a caravan, and that man's situation you described. And also I was wondering if you can comment on the difference, positively or negatively, objectively, since Brexit, whether it has impacted positively or negatively to the migration question, seeing that the European Union migration has sort of, it's not been happening.
So migration is negative from Europe now.
So there is a need. There is a need of workers. These workers are coming from other countries, which is former former countries of colonization. So I would like to comment on that. And just one last thing, I'm an EU settled person for over 25 something. There is a difference the way I am treated when I have a visa thing online as well. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I go on a different queue and it doesn't work, and I just have to chat a little bit. Oh, I live there, and they're like, oh yeah, you just get, so there is a difference, even if the system is the same. But being EU and having different sort of staying here, I'm treated differently with my other people who would look like me, but will have maybe another non-EU visa. And if that system doesn't work, I'm more sort of likely credible to be like, oh yes, she's going back home, and she described where, because they usually ask, what are you doing here? Where are you coming from? How long you've been here? And this sort of question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Simona, maybe you can come in. What is DWP doing about all this? Isn't it their job?
What?
Department of Work and Pensions.
No, this is not the answer.
Okay.
The question I want
Go
to
for
answer.
it. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I'm more into how did things change after Brexit. They changed very dramatically, because before, in 2016, the huge net migration that they wanted to eliminate was something around 150,000 net migration, which was divided precisely into two, 75,000 more or less from the EU that were exercising the right to move within the European Union, and another 70, we're talking 75,000 from third countries, which is around overall 4.6% of total UK population. So the numbers are not this huge as they were pretended that they would be, and that was something that had to be stopped and go below the 100,000. You remember this? Now we have to go below 100,000. Now we are 2022, 920,000 net migration. 2023, 750,000 net migration. 2024 still has to finish around 680,000, which is for me good. Let's put it very much clearly that this for me is a good thing. It's really good that we finally have huge numbers. The majority, as my colleague was saying, are coming actually from India, Nigeria, and Pakistan, with some Chinese, but mostly from Hong Kong. And the numbers are around 2 million from India coming, which means net migration is obviously less, because net migration, as you know, those who come and those who go. So the whole thing was actually really good in terms of increasing the number of migrants, because plus these are almost all regular migrants. They are not irregular, and they have the right to vote because they come from Commonwealth. So the whole issue of political power is being resolved, which explains more or less, but better than when you cannot vote. They vote a national election. The right to vote is based on your residency in the country, but not for 10 years. As the fact that you are resident in the UK is enough to vote a national election, which is absolutely good. It should actually be the case for all migrants, not only for those coming from the Commonwealth. Why is this happening? Because the UK needs migrants. There is no other answer to this. And they actually need regular migrants. They need migrants, they need regular migrants which pay taxes, and they also have the right to vote. This should be very clear, and it's not very clear, apparently, because they are trying to avoid it as much as possible or implement policies which are absolutely, I mean, we'll have to see, because still the Labour government is not talking too much about migration, to be honest, much less than previous governments. They are doing the facts, this is clear, but they're doing the wrong facts. They are basically doing wrong. They did not understand anything. So honestly, I don't know, maybe if you talk to the politicians, tell them, because this is clearly a need. You don't get 920,000 net migrants in a year if you don't need them. All of them regular, eh?
I think part of the problem is like migration turned into a political issue. So it's kind of a competitions who will beat migrant first or harder. So it turned to be a kind of a card. Like, well, they are just like talking about people's life. And it's literally like, this country needs migrants, and when migrants, it is the circle of migrants who come here, they work, have income, pay tax, and they have right to have a health system, to get a health insurance or whatever. They have the right to claim benefits and all this stuff. But as they put as much as in the economy, they got in return. So and it's the history, actually. It's the history of the human. It's migration is the history of the human. No one that we born in different countries, people from the old times moved to different places. So this is the issue.
Okay. Emiliano,
Yeah. I'm going to disagree with you on political power. I think voting is important, but it's just a small part, because otherwise all marginalized. Oh, absolutely. I agree. Huh? But I'm saying otherwise all marginalized communities that had the right to vote would have political power.
I agree, but they still have more than those who do not vote. Let's put it this way.
Well, yeah, it depends. It depends.
No, if
I mean, bankers who cannot vote have more political power, I think, than a care worker who can.
Banker do not vote.
No, I'm saying bankers who cannot vote, like let's say like a French investment banker who cannot vote, has more political power than a care worker who can.
No.
So I'm just saying, but anyways, labor enforcement, really important question. Really, really, really important question. Now, it doesn't actually fall under DWP labor enforcement. Labor enforcement in the UK is a mess. Is a mess for everybody, not just migrant workers, okay? The UK has roughly 4 labor enforcement agencies that do different things. And they're all kind of disconnected and do their own kind of thing, okay? So you have the HMRC, so they also do taxes, right? HMRC knows taxes, but they also do minimum wage enforcement, okay? Important to say, they do minimum wage enforcement. If your wages are above minimum wage, they don't enforce them. You have the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, who in theory, well, the name kind of says it, right? But they are the most under-resourced. They have, I mean, it's very small budget. I can't remember right now. And then you have Health and Safety Executive, which handles health and safety, both on the consumer and on the worker side. And then you have the Gang Masters and Labor Abuse Authority, which in theory handles recruiters in the agriculture sector and modern slavery. Now, the budget of the Gang Masters and Labor Abuse Authority is right now between £6 and £7 million, more roughly, per year. The budget that the Home Office gives it, okay? The Home Office spends more money on pens and paper, on stationery, publishing and printing, than they do on financing the Gang Masters and Labor Abuse Authority. So that gives you a sense of the state of labor enforcement in the UK. The International Labor Organization, which is like the kind of UN body that handles sort of labor issues, and where governments from around the world coordinate on labor issues, has a recommendation on the number of labor inspectors that a country should have. Okay, the UK has a quarter of the number of labor inspectors per capita that the ILO recommends. Okay, among OECD countries, OECD is kind of the club of rich nations, right? Rich. It's like 30 odd countries. The UK is amongst the country that has the fewest per capita labor inspectors amongst the OECD. Gives you a sense of how bad the enforcement is. When it comes to these workers, there's been a bit of a kind of pass the parcel going on about whose responsibility it is to deal with the two particular visas that I talked about. There's this kind of thing of pass the parcel. And you've mentioned David Neal, the independent chief inspector of borders and immigration, who was he's this guy in the government who was supposed to, let's say, roughly check that the Home Office is doing things correctly in terms of immigration, in terms of the immigration system. He did a lot of very critical reports. He eventually got fired because he was doing critical reports about the government. he had, as you do, he was doing his job, so he got fired. He did a report on the seasonal worker visa, the visa for agricultural workers. And one of the recommendations was that you have to have a kind of roadmap to kind of like show who's responsible for what. And you guys have to agree who's responsible for what. This was like 2 years ago. I'll let you guess if that's been done. Okay? Okay, it hasn't been done. All right? So this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem that's not being addressed. And I'm going to just go back to another point. Early on in our research, in the research that we were doing, we did what we call like a listening exercise. So in the research we did on care workers, we brought a bunch of care workers together. We invited them to come, and we also invited lawyers. And the idea was, we're going to talk about the issues you face, but also the lawyers are going to tell you about your rights. So at least you leave today maybe a bit more empowered because you know about your employment rights and you know about your immigration rights. And there's something that just stays in my head. The lawyer, a very good employment lawyer, was talking about people's rights and how to enforce their rights. And a worker spoke up. It's like, yeah, that's fine. In practice, yeah, fantastic. I'll get all this evidence and I'll take my employer to court, to the employment tribunal in practice. But the moment I do that, they'll fire me. And the moment they fire me, I lose my visa. So, you know what I mean? So, yes, there's this difference between having your rights on paper and having your rights in practice. And what we find with the immigration system, when you combine immigration and employment, what you find is a lot of the rights you thought you had as an employee, you cannot exercise them because the immigration system comes down and stops you from exercising because of the threat of deportation. And the threat of deportation being so intrinsically linked with your employment. Finally, on that point, on the ability to enforce your rights through the employment tribunal, because that's, let's say, the fifth kind of pillar of enforcement besides those enforcement agencies. The UK relies a lot on you enforcing your own rights, in all kinds of aspects, right? You have a problem with your landlord, you got to take your landlord to court because forget about the council doing anything. Trust me, I tried with an old landlord. I tried to get the council to do something. Yeah, great. So you have to take everybody to court. That's the way. I wrote something recently about the employment tribunal and seasonal workers. Seasonal workers have a visa for 6 months. That is the maximum you can stay in the UK as a seasonal worker. The employment tribunal has it can take you as long as 2 years to get a hearing before the employment tribunal. So you see the problem, right? And a couple of years ago, they introduced new rules. They introduced new rules which said that most people can't give evidence from abroad. You have to be in the UK to give evidence, to give oral evidence. So if you cannot give evidence in your own case that you bring against your employer, you're not going to win your case. So the system is effectively set up to stop seasonal workers from actually taking their employment to the employment tribunal. So if we look at all these agencies, they're not really well-resourced and not really doing their job. And I'm not even going into the fact of the times when the agencies collaborate with immigration enforcement. I'm not even going into that, okay? And then if you try to self-enforce, so also I think there's another element here, which is like, okay, we got to think about, the other thing I was talking about before, right? This is how the state operates. We have to think about enforcing our own rights as well, thinking about through building power amongst communities that can then resist, strike, take action. Now, obviously, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, especially if you're a seasonal worker. But I think we need to think about ways to do this.
Thanks, Emiliano. I think we could probably stay all night, but we are up against time. So I think I'm going then to give the last word to Zehrah, who's been waiting a little while, I could see, to jump in.
No, not at all. I was actually just going to kind of jump off what was being said around, the hostile environment and the links between the Home Office and other agencies. And so when we're talking about labour enforcement, I know you said you weren't going to get into it, but to just kind of say briefly that, there are lots of examples of labour inspectors working with the Home Office to, essentially discover people working and then using immigration enforcement against them. We've seen that in schools, we've seen that in hospitals, you know, we've seen the ways in which kind of other public services become border guards. And I think that's a really key part of how the hostile environment in the UK has operated. But kind of wanting to end on a positive note, and also thinking about what we've been talking about with regards to building power, I think that if we're thinking about reframing the narrative, I think that's where we need to go next. We need to talk about the examples of migrant communities resisting, examples of people working in solidarity with migrant communities resisting. I think that despite, you know, how hostile and how oppressive, you know, the last government and this government continues to be, we have seen an increase in like communities resisting and coming together in solidarity. We've seen people stopping raids in their communities. We've seen people stopping deportation flights. We've seen, you know, communities coming together to, you know, protect migrant workers who are working for Deliveroo, or, you know, being stopped by the police, you know, and understanding the different ways that we can resist, but not just kind of as, you know, against the immigration system, but understanding, for example, policing and the ways in which policing intersects with border control, the ways in which, you know, workplace oppression, you know, the ways that bosses treat workers intersects with immigration control, understanding it from all these lenses, you know, the digital system and how that intersects. I think it's really important that we can do, you know, whatever we can in whatever position we are to kind of, you know, resist, you know, what is obviously a really hostile environment for migrant communities at the moment.
That is indeed a very good note to end on, Zehrah. And I hope you can join me in thanking our speakers. It's been an immensely rich set of contributions and some pretty kind of lively debate. And it was really, for me, really helped highlight some of the disjunctures between the policy, the political, the media narratives around migration and the kind of realities that you're exposing for us. So thank you very much, everyone.